In this video, we are going to start working on the login user interface. Now, we're not going to quite get to the point where we're mocking our service layer. We'll get to that soon. But I wanted to take this as an opportunity to introduce you guys to the concept of fragments. See, what I want to have happen with this login page is on tablets, I want it to behave differently than on phones. And I want to accomplish this with the least amount of code duplication as possible. To do that, we're going to use a feature given to us by the Android SDK as of Android version 3 called Fragments. Now, fragments are basically these kind of little compositable pieces that are very similar to activities, but can be, again, composed in activities. So a single activity can make use of multiple fragments and have those fragments instantiated. You can kind of think of fragments as views themselves, but way more powerful, because fragments will receive life cycle events, for example. And they're a fairly powerful tool when working with Android. They can also cause some difficulty. So in this video, we're going to discuss how we can use fragments to accomplish our particular goal, as well as how, well, to work with fragments in the first place, and how to deal with things like fragment activity communication. And the end result is that I want there to be a login screen that on the phones, the first login screen that you get to, you just have a row of buttons. And the buttons will say things like login with your account, register new account, login with Facebook, login with Twitter. But on tablets, I want those other buttons to still be there, but I want the actual login form itself to be inline inside of the screen, because tablets, are so much bigger than phones. We'll be able to fit the entire login screen within that single view. So so this is pretty much going to be mostly UI focused. We're not going to worry too much about the implementation details of what we're doing, or as far as what the logic behind our buttons and stuff is going to happen. We're mostly going to worry about how things are presented. So let's go ahead and get started. What I want to do here is I first want to start off. We're going to start off on creating a header that's going to be imported into each one of our registration, login sort of activities. Then we're going to jump in and create the narrow login activity view. Then we're going to put together the fragment. We're going to import it into the narrow view, and then we're going to build our tablet view. So that's kind of the order that I want to go. Unfortunately, like I said, doing things like this, there's a lot of back and forth. So I'm trying to minimize the amount of back and forth, and as a result, we're going to be working on slightly an unrelated thing at first. So the first thing I want to do is, the way that I design this app is on all of the login and registration activities, there's kind of this header, this big blue header thing that I wanted to have throughout those different activities. And because it's a piece of view logic that I want repeated throughout a variety of activities, it makes sensible to turn it into a layout that can be included in other layouts. So that's where we're going to start. So what I'm going to do here on layout is I'm going to right click, hit new layout resource file, and I'm going to go ahead and create a include, and then we're going to say login header. Now, another thing is, since we added this project to Git, it's going to ask me every time I create a file if I want to add it into the Git repository. And under pretty much every circumstance, I'm going to select yes. I'm always going to hit yes. Every file I create specifically is going to go in the Git repository, unless it's an ignored file. But how often do you create a file that would be ignored? And in those cases, it won't automatically add anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, remember, don't ask again, and yes. So just keep in mind, every time I make a new file, it's going to go green like that, indicating that it's been added to the repository. So let's go ahead and make our header. So I'm going to jump into the text view. We have this linear layout here. I'm actually going to replace it with something else. I'm going to replace it with a layout that we haven't talked much about yet, and that's going to be the frame layout. So I'm going to replace the linear layout with the frame layout, and I'm going to remove the orientation attribute because it's no longer recognized. Now, in Android, you can have attributes that don't exist, and it's not going to complain. Well, it'll complain. The IDE will complain, but no one else will. The compiler won't. However, the orientation attribute in this case is not understood by the frame layout and therefore is going to be ignored. So there's no reason for it to be there. Oh, and I also am definitely going to change the layout height to wrap content. Okay, so frame layout. We haven't really discussed this yet. Now, frame layout is the reason we haven't discussed it is because it's so simple. The frame layout is the simplest of all the layouts insofar as it allows you to align your objects, the views, in any way that you want, but it doesn't consider how those views interact with other views. So views can be stacked on each other. So frame layout's actually a fairly powerful layout, but it does the least amount of work as far as layouts are concerned, and it's the simplest to understand. The frame layout is literally just a frame that we can put stuff in, and that stuff will get stacked if we put views on top of each other. Now inside this frame layout, I'm going to do a text view with a layout width of wrap content and the height of wrap content. It's really irrelevant. The text is going to be Yora in all caps. And so we can kind of start to see this come together already. It doesn't look that interesting, so let's go ahead and make it a little better. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say text color. I'm going to give the color, I'm not going to make it white just yet. I'm going to go ahead and say text style is bold. And let's give it a text size of 24 SP. Okay, I think that should work just fine. Now let's go ahead and orient this text in the way that I want it to work with the header. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say padding top is going to be 50 dp, padding bottom is going to be 50 dp. And so now you see that the extent of our frame layout is now this big. And the last thing I want to do is remember how I said that the views inside of a frame layout can decide for themselves how they get laid out, how they get in which direction do they orient themselves. That's controlled through the layout gravity attribute. Now the layout gravity attribute is a layout parameter. Now I know I've discussed or talked about layout parameters in the past and how all layout parameters will have the layout underscore prefix. Why am I making a point to say that? The reason is there's another attribute called gravity on the text view itself. So there's a layout gravity and there's a gravity. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that the layout gravity is a layout parameter that is passed into the frame layout. So the frame layout is going to get the layout gravity. It's going to be told what gravity the child view is asking for it to use. And of course the gravity refers to its orientation, its position. Do we want it to be centered, aligned to the right, aligned to the left, and so on. So the layout gravity is passed into the parent, so that the parent knows how to correctly lay out this view. The gravity, however, this is not a layout parameter. So while the layout gravity is a layout parameter, will be available to every single view that's a child of this frame layout, the gravity parameter, or gravity attribute rather, is a attribute specific to the text view and has no correlation whatsoever to the layout gravity. Now, in the case of a text view and its derivatives such as buttons, the gravity is going to determine the gravity for the content inside of it, if that makes sense. So we could give the content a center or a right aligned or a left aligned and so on. So that's the difference. Layout gravity tells the view group how to lay out the view. Gravity tells the contents within the view how to lay themselves out. So we're going to use layout gravity, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give a layout gravity of center horizontal. And that's what we get. We now have a centered horizontal header. However, I'm not a big fan of this color, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do something interesting. The background color I want on this frame layout is going to be a color that I'm going to be reusing throughout this entire course. It's going to be a very common color for a variety of our things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it into a values XML file. Now the values XML file is I'm going to create one, and it's going to contain a lot of the commonly reused colors so that we have a simple place to organize them. It's also really nice to take colors that you use a lot and stuff them in an XML file so that you can refer to them by name so that you don't have to remember these hex values. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create the value first. So I'm going to go over here into my resource folder, right-click my values folder, select new, and select values resource file. For the color, for the file name, I'm going to call it colors. Then I'll hit OK. And I get an XML file with the resources element. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and create and open up a color. The name of the color is going to be primary color dark. The value of the color is going to be that, I think it's, if you look back at the material design guidelines from Google, this is going to be the dark blue, or the 500 weighted blue. And it's going to be 2196 F3. And that's our primary color dark. Alright, so now that we have that color, I can come back here into the include login header, and as a new attribute on my frame layout, I can say background. And then I can say @color / primary color dark. And that makes our background that blue color. And then to finish this off, I'm going to go ahead and make this text view white. So I'm going to say text color FFF. I'm not going to bother putting white into the colors XML file, nor am I going to bother doing, primary color dark inverse. Because when we have a dark color, when I use that term dark color, I'm referring to something that will look good on a white foreground, or as a background to a white foreground. So I don't feel bad hard coding in white in that particular case. And I'm probably going to hard code, in the interest of time, I'm probably going to hard code a lot of these colors into this application. It's up to your discretion of when you want to break that out into a colors XML file or not. Anyway, so that's about it. Also, one last thing. This colors XML file is arbitrarily named. It's irrelevant that it's called colors. I could have just as easily put this color in the same file that I define my strings, or the same file that I describe my styles. As you see, all these XML files are completely identical. The fact that they have different names is just a convenient convention. Alright, so yeah, that's our login header. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and fill out my login view for phones. So my activity login view, I'm going to delete this button, by the way. We don't need this button anymore. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fill this login view out for phones. So I'm going to keep this device as a phone in my preview. And let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, open up, I'm going to say include, and I'm going to go ahead and include in, obviously, our login header. So I'm going to say layout equals include login header. Again, our layout attribute is not prefixed with Android because the include tag is something that's built into the layout inflator. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give this an ID. I'm going to give an ID of +/, and then I'm going to go ahead and say include login header. Now, what do I want an ID here? Well, you'll see in a moment that we're going to be making things relative to this. Because what I want is I want there to be a linear layout that is centered in the remaining space of that empty area. So in the remaining space here that isn't taken up by this header, I want there to be a linear layout that I can fill in with a bunch of buttons. So to do that, I'm going to say linear layout with a width of, let's go ahead and say match parent, a height of wrap content. That's important because if it wasn't wrap content, it wouldn't work properly here. And I'm going to go ahead and fix a small mistake that I just made. The layout height, I do want to be match parent. Derp. See, the reason is now look at this linear layout. See how it fills everything? But watch this. Now I can say below, so layout below, include login header. Now look at this. So now that we're below the login header, our linear layout now takes up or occupies the space between the header and the bottom of the screen. So what does that give us? It doesn't seem like this is going to be centered in the middle. Well, remember that whole discussion about gravity? We can apply gravity to linear layouts. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give it a gravity, not a layout gravity. Because a layout gravity is something that only applies to certain layout groups. A gravity is what applies to that layout's children or child content. So I'm going to specify a gravity of center. I could also just do center vertical as well. Okay, so next up, I'm going to go ahead and give this some margin. So I'm going to say margin start is 16 dp and margin end is 16 dp. Of course, start and end are only going to work if you're targeting Android 4.2 or above. If you're targeting Android 4.1 or 4 and above, you'll have to change that to margin left and margin right. And then finally, really the only required property other than width and height for a linear layout is the orientation, and we'll specify vertical. All right, now let's go ahead and create our buttons. So I'm going to do button with the layout width of match parent, layout height of wrap content, which is going to be common for all of our buttons. We're going to do a text of Yura sign in, or how about to keep our terminology consistent, I'll say login. So this is going to be, this button is, when you press it, it's going to take you to the Yura account sign in page, not the Facebook sign in page. Then we'll go ahead and do a match parent wrap content button with the text of Yura register. Of course, I do want to give these buttons IDs, so I'll fix that already. On the login button, you want to make sure to give it an ID of plus ID slash activity login, login, I guess. Register is going to be ID activity login register. Now we're going to do two more buttons. Both are going to be match parent and wrap content. The first one is going to be Facebook login. And it's going to have an ID of activity login Facebook. And then we're going to have a final button with a match parent and wrap content. I messed up that first one, didn't I? Match parent, wrap content. And then we're going to give it a text of, or we're going to do a Google login, not Twitter. I think I said Twitter in the last video. I misspoke, sorry. And we'll do ID slash activity login Google. Okay, the last thing I want to do is, I think actually that should be good. I'm not too concerned about the aesthetics of this particular page because it's not that exciting. If you wanted to, you could play around with backgrounds and all that fun stuff. We'll go into drawables and styling stuff later. I don't want to focus too much on the styling aspect at this point. Really, the most important thing, though, that I want to drive home in these videos, at least this particular part of this video, is laying things out. So I showed you guys a technique on how you can have a header, a reusable header, but then have content that is centered vertically within the remaining space that header provided. Now remember, this has all happened because this linear layout has a gravity set to center vertical. If instead I set the gravity to bottom, look what happens. Notice how the content drops to the bottom. The linear layout stays where it is because we're not setting a layout parameter. So the linear layout's always going to say the same width, the same height, and the same x and the same y. But when we change the gravity, its children are going to change. So we can set it to bottom, we can set it to top. Right isn't going to do anything because these are all match parent widths. But like, for example, if this was a wrap content on the layout width, notice how if we set the gravity to right, or the right or to end, it goes to the right. And if we do start or to left, it goes to the left. Or we could do center, which centers it both horizontally and vertically, or center horizontal, which centers it horizontally, or center vertically, which centers it vertically. Of course, center vertical is what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and change this back to match parent for its width. Okay, so that is our activity login page. So this is the phone login. We'll worry about making it pretty later. So now we have these 4 buttons. So let's go ahead and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new activity because we need at least 2 activities, right? This activity, this login activity, is going to serve kind of a dual purpose. It's going to be used for both phones and tablets, so it's going to have kind of this split personality. However, when we click on the You're a Login button, we want to get our login form, you please enter your username and your password form, right? So that means we're going to need another activity. Now we could do some fragment kung fu here, or we could just keep things simple and introduce another activity so that when we launch this You're a Login, we get that other activity. The purpose of the other activity is simply to host the login fragment. All right, so let's go ahead and get that out of the way just so we have that activity built. So we don't have to worry about putting together any more activities in this video. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here, I'm going to jump into activities, I'm going to right click, select new, select Java class, and I'm going to call this login narrow activity. So I'm doing login narrow activity so that it sorts next to the login activity. Instead of narrow login activity, it's login narrow activity. Just again, so it sorts as you see in the left-hand side. It sorts nicely. Get rid of that. I need to change that. That's really annoying me. Anyway, login narrow activity is going to extend base activity. It's going to have an override public or protected void on create method with a bundle saved state with a super on create saved state. And then we're going to say set content view r dot layout dot activity underscore login narrow. Now I'm going to hit alt enter so I import r. And of course r comes from combuzz Eura. And for activity login narrow, because we don't have this layout made yet, I'm just going to hit alt enter, select create layout resource file, blah blah blah. And then I'm going to go ahead and we're just let's go ahead and use linear layout on this one. So do linear layout and then hit OK. All right, so let's go ahead and break all this up so it's a little nicer looking. And as far as this particular activity, really, we're going to have our include. So I'm going to say include, and it's going to have a layout of include login header. And we're just going to keep it at this for now, because the next step is going to require that we actually have our fragment available to be instantiated. All right. So now we have pretty much all the bits and pieces in place, except for, of course, the tablet view, the tablet layout. We don't have that written yet, but that's okay because we can't write the entire tablet layout until we write the fragment. So let's go about actually creating the fragment. So again, just to recap, what exactly is a fragment? In Android, a fragment is really nothing more than a light activity. It's an activity, you can think of it as an activity that can be placed into other activities, composed into other activities. The common example of fragments, which I'm really sick of reading about, are the master detail flows, where on a tablet, you will have a list view visible and a details view visible. And then you click on an item in the list view, and the item shows up in the details view. On a phone, you only see the list view, you click on an item, and then it switches over to a details view. One of the most common showcase demo things in the existence of fragments and, well, in the existence of adaptive mobile interfaces in general ever made. And that's why I'm so annoyed or bored with it. But you can kind of think of fragments as being able to accomplish something like that, where you can kind of, instead of creating your activities as just this monolithic activity, you break your activity into these little chunks that you can rearrange depending on the screen. You can kind of think of them as these include files, except for significantly more powerful, because fragments can not only introduce additional layout material, but it can also introduce additional functionality. I do want to point out, however, it's a very common technique to abuse fragments and have fragments that don't show a view. We're going to see an example of that later. But for right now, we're not going to worry about it. Instead, we are going to create a fragment. And again, that fragment is going to show us a login form on this layout, and it's also going to show us a login form on the tablet login layout. So now what I'm going to do is over here on my root package, I'm going to right click, select new package, and then I'm going to say fragments. So just to keep things kind of together, I guess, I'm going to write a fragments package. Under here, I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call this base fragment. So just like with our activities, our fragments are going to have a base. Again, that's because a fragment is very much like an activity. It is going to be a class, just like our activities. It's going to receive lifecycle events, just like our activities. It's going to be able to create its own layout, just like our activities. Again, the only difference is that the fragments, or one of the biggest differences, is that the fragments can be composed inside of activity. So an activity can have 0 to many fragments instantiated inside of it. So let's go ahead and remove that ugly comment. And let's start off by extending fragment. So this is going to be a little fun. Go ahead and type in fragment, uppercase F, and you'll notice we have two choices. Ooh, yay, super fun, awesome support time. I haven't really talked about this a whole lot because it requires a little bit of a discussion. But I guess to put this sort of as quickly as I can, what happened is fragments were introduced in Android 3 Honeycomb, which was the tablet-only release of Android. And when fragments were released, Google was like, well, that's really cool, but we want Android 2 devices to be able to use fragments now. So how do we do that? Well, what we could do is we could basically copy and paste all the code out of the Android trunk, stuff it into another package, call it a support library, and then allow people to reference that. And that's where the support libraries come from. The support libraries are basically when Google makes something cool in a new version of Android and wants older versions of Android to be able to use it, they'll go ahead and they'll, for all intents and purposes, copy and paste that code out of the trunk of Android itself and dump it into a support library package that can be referenced from older versions of Android. That's why we'll see support everywhere. However, in this particular case, since we're not targeting Android 4 or Android 4.1 or below, or Android 2 and below, we can use this version of the fragment. Now, this version of the fragment, as you see, comes from the android.app package, whereas this version of the fragment comes out of the android.support.v4 app package. We want the one that comes from the native Android app package, not from the support library. I want to point out, though, that the whole discussion with support libraries does not end here, and we're going to see other instances of it throwing us off later in this series, because unfortunately, these are two separate classes. They're not interchangeable, and they have different dependencies. Other things, some bits of Android code will require we use the support library, some won't, and it becomes a big mess. We'll deal with it as best as possible throughout this series. Needless to say, I'm not a big fan of this particular way of handling version discrepancies in Android, but I'm really not a fan of any of the ways in which Google handles version discrepancies in Android, so we'll just have to go ahead and live with it. All right, enough talking about support libraries anyway. I'll go ahead and hit enter, and we now have a fragment. That is all we need to do to make a fragment. Really? It's not that exciting, but this is the base fragment. So let's go ahead and make it abstract, because we don't want to instantiate it at all, directly anyway. And then I'm going to do a protected Yora application, so that we have that same application field as we have in our base activity. And really, for now, that's all I'm going to deal with. So, I'm going to go ahead and do an override. Now, this is going to be interesting. I'm going to do public void on create bundle saved state, super.onCreate saved state, and then I'm going to say application equals your application. And then Notice this, I can't say get application, but I can say get activity dot get application. Okay, so let's talk about this code I just wrote, because there's a couple interesting notes. First of all, notice that I say public void on create. See, if I go ahead and jump into the fragment source code and find on create, you'll notice it's defined as public. This is different than the activities. Activities define their onCreate method as protected. So, that's an important distinction. You won't be able to do protected void onCreate inside of a fragment. You just won't. Just use public. I always prefer using the least required accessibility when I write my code and do my overrides. In this case, however, you have no option other than to use public because the parent superclass is public. Next up, we invoke super on create just like we always do in every overload that we get from Android. And then finally, we do application equals your application. But notice how I don't say get application directly. Remember, that's how we got the base application from, or the application from the base activity. We invoked the get application method directly, which came from the activity class. But in a fragment, we first have to get the parent activity before we can get the application, because there is no get application method in the fragment. The fragment doesn't have a reference to the application. I'm sure it does somewhere, but at least not in a way that's accessible through a get method named getApplication. So we have to go through the parent activity. So this gives us the first example of the concept of fragments being attached to activities. So we talked about before how fragments can exist inside of activities. Activities can create as many fragments as they want. Well, now think of it the other way. Fragments get attached to activities, so they're owned by a particular activity. When we say get activity, we are getting a reference to the activity that owns this particular fragment. All right, so that is our base fragment class for now. There's going to be more fun stuff we will deal with in the future, but for now, we're just going to leave it as it is. And we're going to go ahead and move on and build our login fragment. Note that I'm not going to make a corresponding base authenticated fragment. That would be irrelevant. The reason it'd be irrelevant is because our base authenticated activity is going to take care of that, because the activity will always be instantiated before the fragments will be instantiated. So we don't have to worry about checking if we're logged in or not. That is controlled by the activity, not the fragment. All right, underneath the fragment's namespace, I'm going to go, or package, sorry, C# snuck up on me again. I'm going to right-click, select New Java Class, and I'm going to call this a login fragment. So the login fragment, I'm going to remove that useless comment, and then I'm going to say login fragment extends base fragment. So now, by proxy, login fragment extends fragment, which means this is a valid fragment. Our fragment can now be inserted and removed and manipulated inside of our activity. However, it's very boring because it doesn't do anything. It's an empty class. So now we have to start thinking about what it is we want this fragment to do. Well, basically what we want is we want this fragment to show a view that has a username field, a password field, and a button field, and a progress bar for when you hit the button and you're waiting on the login operation to complete. That's what we want this fragment to do. How do we do that? Well, we could go ahead and do it like we did with activities, with an overloading the onCreate method, but that's not going to work, because as you'll notice, there's no setContentView method. Because there's no setContentView, how do we set the layout for a fragment? We can't do it through the onCreate method, so how do we do that? Well, the answer is very simple. There's going to be another method that's going to be invoked by Android itself to get the view object that's going to be representative of this fragment's layout. So I'm going to do override. Now, this is a signature that you guys, I highly recommend you memorize. I highly recommend you memorize because you're going to be typing it a lot every fragment that you create. It's not that difficult to memorize. It's going to be a public void on create view, or sorry, public view on create view, layout inflator, view group root, and bundle saved state. Basically what we're looking at is the opposite of an activity. Now, see, an activity, when you create an activity, the onCreate method is invoked on it. And then the activity itself says set content view, right? As we saw with our login activity, set content view in the onCreate method. Well, fragments are the other way around. Android is going to request that we return it a inflated view object. And this view object can be anything, really. We can create the view without a layout file at all. We can create our own implementation of view. We can return an instantiation of an anonymous inner class that extends the class view, if we wanted to. Or we can use the layout inflator that was provided to us by this handy parameter and inflate a view. So let's go ahead and do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say view equals inflator. Sorry, not view.inflate. Inflator dot inflate r dot layout dot fragment underscore login root false. So let's go ahead and import this r, and then let's go ahead and discuss what this method does. All right, so the first parameter shouldn't come as any surprise. First parameter is going to be our layout resource, the layout resource responsible for describing the view in XML. Of course, it's erroring out right now because we don't have a layout file yet called fragment login, but we will momentarily, so don't worry about that. Now, the second parameter is the view group root. So what is that? Why are we passing that in? Well, the reason is in order to do some sizing calculations, the layout inflator needs to have a reference to the view group that is inevitably going to become the root object that contains the inflated layout. So in order to do the proper sizing calculations, it needs to know the dimensions and layout parameters of the parent view object, right? So that makes sense? So we need to tell it where it's going to end up. Where is this view going to be placed in the view hierarchy? Then we have this one right here, this parameter, false. Now, it's not very often we're going to use, well, and actually the funny thing is you'd think it's not very often we're going to use false for this parameter, but oftentimes we do. And this parameter is a Boolean, and it says attached to root. Now, what does that mean? Well, it literally means after this inflator is done inflating the XML file, then do you want to automatically add this view as a child to the view group that you passed in as the second parameter? Now, it seems like a very reasonable thing to do in this particular case. Why wouldn't you want to do it? Well, the answer is that the view returned by the onCreateView method is going to be automatically added. So after this method is done being invoked, the view is going to be added to the view group anyway. Meaning if this third parameter was set to the default, as in it wasn't supplied, or was set to true, what's going to happen is the view is going to be inserted twice and you'll get an error. And that's no fun. So you want to make sure that your parameters are the layout you want to inflate, the view group that's going to be the parent, which we don't have to worry about because that's provided to us by Android in the root parameter. And then finally, false for whether or not we want to attach to root. Okay, so again, just to recap, inflation refers in Android, refers to the concept of taking an XML file and turning it into real Java objects. So the XML file describes Java objects, and inflating the description of those Java objects gives us real Java objects. And so that's what the inflator does. It turns the XML resource into a view object. So you've been using this layout inflator all throughout the course already. It's just been hidden behind the setContentView method on the activity. All right, so what's the last thing we've got to do on onCreateView? Simply return view. No, second to last thing. You'll notice, why aren't you just inflating the view and returning on the same line? That's because we will be referencing this view in a later, because we're going to need to go into this view to get subviews in it to reference things like the edit box for the password and stuff. Okay, so now that we have that all done, we're ready to go ahead and implement our actual login screen, our actual login form. So I'm going to hit Alt-Enter, and then Enter. And then for here, the root element, I'm going to have be a relative layout. It's not immediately obvious why I need, or I'm going to have that, but it'll become obvious when we go and write it. And the file name I'm going to leave as fragment_login. I'm not going to give it any qualifiers, so I'm just going to hit OK or enter. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, once I'm done reorganizing this, is I'm going to change the height to wrap content. That's because this is a fragment. This is something that's supposed to be composed in other things. I mean, you don't want your fragments layout parameters to be so greedy that they take up more space in the parent view than you expected, right? So generally speaking, you're going to set your fragments layout height to wrap content on the root element, generally speaking. Okay, so let's go ahead and this is going to be really straightforward. Let's go ahead and just go through this real fast. We're going to have an edit text with a match parent and wrap content, a hint of username, a single line of true, an ID of plus ID slash fragment login username, and a margin bottom of 8 device independent pixels. We're going to have another edit text of match parent wrap content. Hint is going to be password. Single line is going to be true. Input type is going to be text password. Margin bottom is going to be 8dp. It's going to be set below login username, and its ID is going to be plus ID slash fragment login password. That's our username and password. Then we'll have a button. So button layout width of match parent wrap content text is going to be log in. It's going to be below password. It's going to have, let's do a background of, let's see. I want to go ahead and introduce a new color resource. So I'm going to do color / and then we're going to do primary color darker. Now, I actually have never done this before. I wonder what's kind of going to happen if I hit Alt-Enter here. It says create color resource, right? Or resource file. And then there's create color value resource. I think I want to go ahead and say create color value resource primary color darker. Hit enter. And, oh, check this out. It automatically selected file name colors, which is what I want. And then for the resource value, I'm going to do #3F51B5, which is going to be a darker version of that dark blue. And then I'll hit OK. And if I jump into my values and colors file, notice how the primary color darker was added. So that was just a really quick way of adding that. I've never done that before. I didn't know it would pick up on the right file, but it seems it has a bunch of sensible defaults and it ended up in the right place. So as a result, I was really quickly able to add that color. Alternatively, you could have gone to the resource folder, opened up values, gone into colors, and added that color yourself manually. Either way, that was pretty exciting, I guess. Let's go back to fragment login. Let's give it a text color of white for the button. And really, I think that's about it, except I do want to go ahead and give it an ID of... come on. Fragment login button. And that... should be it. I might want to add some padding later, but we'll see how it looks on our other views before I get worried about adding in padding. So, I guess I can go ahead and associate this. So I'll say associate with other activity, and unfortunately it doesn't allow me to associate to fragments. So we'll just ignore that. Anyway, that is our fragment. So yeah, what we can do now is we can go into our layout activity login narrow, and we can finish the implementation here. So basically the implementation here is going to include in our fragment. So there's a couple of ways of instantiating a fragment. you can instantiate one yourself manually in code very easily just by instantiating the object and adding it to a fragment transaction. Or you can actually have the layout itself handle that for you. So that's what we're going to do. So what I'm going to do here is, first of all, I'm going to create a frame layout with a width of matched parent and a height of matched parent. Now, why am I doing that? I'm doing that because just like before with our buttons, I want the layout form to be centered inside the remaining content here, right? So at this point, we now have this frame layout. Inside the frame layout is taking up the remaining content between the root layout and the header. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say fragment. Now, the fragment element allows us to instantiate a fragment. That's really not that exciting. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say the name of the fragment is going to be our login fragment. And then I'm going to provide a layout width of fill parent, height of wrap content, and that really should be about it. But see, here's the thing. The thing about this, though, is at this point, Android Studio doesn't know what layout corresponds to this fragment. Now, it knows we're instantiating a class. It knows what class we're doing. And all in all, this is perfectly valid. Because when it comes to the runtime, Android will figure this all out for us. It'll know which view the login fragment instantiates, and everything will be awesome. But in order for Android Studio to give us a preview of the fragment, we need to tell it what layout is going to correspond to this particular fragment. And we do that by using the tools namespace, or by clicking on this button right here. So I'll go ahead and click on this button, and in case this button does not appear for you guys, I'll show you guys what it did. So I'm going to click on this button, and what it did was it added in a new XML namespace for tools, like how we saw before when we were able to associate our activity to a layout. Then, on the fragment tag itself, you'll notice that it specifies a layout using the tools namespace. So that now we can now see our fragment inside of our frame layout. So that's really cool. I also want to go ahead and do one more thing. I want to give this an ID. I'm going to say ID activity, and I'm going to say login narrow fragment. Now the reason for that is you'll notice actually in this warning that helpfully reminded me of this fact. If the fragment tag does not specify an ID, it won't be able to preserve its state between orientation changes. So you know how before when I said we have this on-saved instance state and on-restore instance state, and that has that bundle thing? You know how I said before when you rotate your device, your activity gets destroyed and recreated. And if you have a view, and that view doesn't have an ID, it can't store its state into a bundle. In this case, if we don't give this fragment an ID, even though we're not going to reference this ID in our own code anywhere, it won't be able to save its state to a bundle, and it'll lose all of its state information when you rotate the device, when Android tries to recreate the fragment for us. Alright, so we're almost there. So let's go ahead, and on the frame layout, I'm going to give it some parameters. I'm going to give it a padding of 16 dp, and that's going to give us a nice padding. And then finally, on this fragment itself, I'm going to give it a layout gravity of center. Center vertical, I guess. And now we have our phone login form. So that's super exciting. We now have a login button for our phones. So now, in fact, we should be able to just hit build and run this, and we should see everything work in the way that we want it to. So if I come over here, if I hit Euro login, I don't have the code to handle that yet. Let's go ahead and finish that real fast. The only bit of code we need for the rest of this video. So I'm going to jump back into activities. I'm going to jump into login activity. And I'm also going to bring in our activity login. And remember, this view is what's going to be shown on phone devices. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a note of this ID, of this button. It's activity login login. Then I'm going to go into login activity, and I'm going to remove this do login method, because that was just there for testing previously in the last video. Then I'm going to say private view login button, login button. Then I'm going to say login button equals find view by ID, r.id activity login login. Then I'm going to do something interesting. I'm going to say if login button does not equal null, then login button dot set on click listener this. So what am I doing here? Well, this login button isn't going to appear on tablets. Why not? Because the login button is effectively going to be replaced by the fragment itself. So we can detect if we're in tablet mode or not by checking to see if this login button actually exists. And then we can set the on-click listener to ourselves in this case, because we now know that it exists. If we didn't have this check in here and we didn't have a login button, it wasn't found, an exception would be thrown, a null reference exception. Okay, so I'm just going to set the on-click listener to this. Let's go ahead and put our keyboard cursors on this Alt-Enter to make login activity implement on-click listener. Let's hit enter and enter. Now our login activity implements on-click listener, and it has our on-click method. In the on-click method, I'm going to rename the parameter to view. Then I'm going to say if view equals login button, then start activity, new intent, this login narrow activity class. Now I'll hit play. We're going to be changing this code up here soon. This is just there for demonstration purposes. Just to see that now when we hit the URL login, we get an exception. So that was actually good that we did that. And I just remembered what I forgot. I forgot to add the narrow login activity to the manifest. So it was good we did that test. Let's hop over into our manifest folder, open up Android manifest, and I'm going to go ahead and add an activity with the name of login narrow activity. All right. So now that we have that done, we can go ahead and hit run, and we should be able to see our fragment. Let's go ahead and hit URL login and check that out. We have our fragment. So this is our narrow page, but we have the fragment instantiated inside of it, and we can hit back, of course. All right, so I apologize for the length of this video. I want to do one more thing before we sign off, though, so I apologize for that. What I want to go ahead and do is I want to build up the tablet version of this really fast. So the tablet version of the login view, which is going to include the login fragment. So I'm going to right-click Layout, go to New, Layout Resource File. Then I'm going to say activity_login. So this resource file is going to basically replace the resource file if our screen size is a particular height or a particular width. For the root element, I'm going to say relative layout. Then I'm going to scroll down to, let's see here, smallest screen width, add it to our chosen qualifiers, and I'm going to give this a value of 600, which is good for determining tablet sizes. Then let's hit OK. Now you'll notice something really cool here is that our preview window automatically gave us this tablet skin. So that's pretty cool. Now let's go over to text, and let's just go ahead and bang this guy out real fast. It shouldn't take that long because it's going to be pretty straightforward. I want to change this actually to a Nexus 7 because I think the Nexus 7 skin looks better. It's really irrelevant. I just think that looks better. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is not open up login activity. First thing I want to do is include our header. So I'm going to say include. I'm going to give it an ID of include login header. I'm going to give it a layout of include login header, and that's going to be it. And now you see our header is now appearing on our tablet device. Then I'm going to do a linear layout with a width of fill parent, a height of wrap content. Then, all right, let's go ahead and get started. Margin start is going to be 100 dp. Margin end is going to be 100 dp. Center horizontal is going to be true. Let's go ahead and give it a orientation of vertical for our linear layout. And let's make sure it's below our include login header. And that should be good. Actually, what I can go ahead and do is I can say gravity center, and I can go ahead and give its layout height of a fill parent. I made the same mistake again, didn't I? I need to make sure that my width and my height are both fill parent and the gravity is center. So it's basically the same pattern that we had before. Okay, so inside of this, we are going to have a frame layout. This frame layout is going to contain our fragment. We're doing a frame layout so that we can have a nice little background on it. The layout width is going to be a fill parent. Height is going to be a wrap content. Then we're going to give it a padding of 16 dp and a background of DDD, which is a nice light gray. Inside of this frame layout, we're going to create a fragment. Fragment's going to be a fill parent wrap content like before. It's going to be fill parent wrap content is a very common sort of thing to do. We're going to give it a name of login fragment. We're going to give it a ID of +ID / activity login fragment. And we're going to go ahead and click on this to get our tools layout fragment login so that we can see the preview inside of our preview window. And also note that the tools namespace appeared at the top of the file. All right, now that we have our fragment displaying, we can go ahead and create our other buttons. We have 3 buttons to implement. I'm going to go ahead and say button 1 is going to have a width of match parent, height of wrap content. It's going to have a margin top of, let's do 8 dp. A text of Yora register, an ID of activity login register. Of course, make sure we do that correctly right there. Then we want a linear layout with let's do a width of fill parent, height of wrap content. This linear layout is going to contain 2 buttons on it. And we're going to make sure that we have our margin top set to 8 dp and that our orientation is horizontal because we want to have 2 buttons in here. Then inside of here, we're going to have 1 button with the layout width of fill parent, height of wrap content. Text is Facebook login. How did I capitalize that on the other one, just for consistency's sake? Okay, so Facebook login. And we're going to give this a layout weight of 1. So that it'll when we insert the next button, they'll both take up equal amounts of space. And we'll do a margin end of 8 dp and an ID of +ID / activity login Facebook. All right, so now that I've done that, let's go ahead and insert our next button, which is going to have a width of fill parent, height of wrap content, weight of 1, and then we're going to go ahead and give it a margin start of 8 dp. We're going to have a text of Google login, and we're going to give it an ID of ID / activity login Facebook. Notice how I'm giving these, or sorry, Google derp. Thanks for that IDE. Notice how I'm giving these the same IDs, or giving these buttons the same IDs as the button IDs of the normal login narrow. You know, the phone version of this. So this is going to have the same register login and register Facebook and Google button IDs as this are register Facebook and Google IDs. And that's important because it'll reduce the amount of code, because effectively on both layouts they're going to do the same thing. Anyway, that's really all I actually wanted to do. So the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to launch this. No, I'm not. I'm going to open up Genymotion. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a tablet device. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Add. I'm going to select Android version 444. And let's select a Google Nexus 7. And I'm just going to click on it and hit Next. And I'm going to clear all that out because I find that ugly. Hit Next. And we're going to download our files. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video so this video doesn't get any more longer than it has to be, which right now it's actually pretty long. And now we have our device created. So I'll hit Finish. I'll come in here and edit it a little bit. For processors, 1 gig of memory, actually that's perfect. So I'm going to keep it as it is. And then I'll start the device. So the first start might take a little bit of time, so I'll pause the video one more time. Alright, so now that we have that all set up, let's hit OK to dismiss that. And we now have a Nexus 7. So I'll move that out of the way. I'll close that out. Then I'm going to hit the Run button up here. Now because a new device has been added to ADB, even if you selected use the same device for future launches, it's now going to bring up 2 devices, or at least the device chooser again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Control, and I'm going to select the second device. And then I'm going to say use same device for future launches, and hit OK. What this is going to do is it's going to launch the application to both devices simultaneously, and they're already launched. So now we have a phone and a tablet. So now you see the login fragment exists on the tablet right there, but on the phone I have to click You're a login to get the activity that hosts this fragment. And of course notice how we have a consistent header between both of our activities. In fact, we have 3 layouts going on right here. We have the tablet layout, we have the phone layout, and we have the second phone layout for hosting the fragment. Anyway, yeah, that's how to handle that sort of thing. We're not going to be doing this sort of thing for every single layout and activity that we have in this application, even if it would make sense, because of how time-consuming it is. But in this particular instance, I really wanted to show you guys an example of using fragments as an introduction that wasn't the same thing as those master detail flow tutorials you see everywhere. Anyway, I think that pretty much wraps everything up that I wanted to do today. So I'll see you guys in the next video.